Well, good morning. Glad to have you all here. No, I'm glad to be here this morning. I guess I said that wrong. I'm glad to have you all here too. And glad that Lainey could be with me coming down here today. And in fact, she drove me down here. You know what they say, you can't keep a good woman down, and that's the truth. This morning's lesson is about the table. God has always had in his plan a table. You and I know the importance of a table. A table is a place where people gather. A table is a place where we eat. A table is a place where we celebrate. A table is a place where we renew acquaintances. In Psalm 23 is probably the favorite Bible passage of maybe the majority of people who profess Christianity. And I know it's the favorite passage, it has to be the favorite passage of our Jewish friends. It's just a beautiful, beautiful poetic passage about God and his relationship with his people. I think the most intriguing part of Psalm 23 is verse 5, where it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." A couple of interesting things about that statement as far as I'm concerned. One is, in all of this talking about how God cares for us, it says that God is the one who prepares a table. Usually you think of a servant or the one who is taking care of the family, preparing the table, getting the table ready. But God prepares a table. And then really the most intriguing part of it is, it says, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." In the presence of the enemy is not where you normally prepare a table. But the psalmist says, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." In the worst of places, God prepares a table that is there for fellowship, a table that is there for sustenance, and a table that is there more for celebration. Because that's what this table is about. Now, when you talk about him preparing a table in the presence of the enemy, then that leads me into this thought about the table that he set for his people Israel as a promise for the table that he was going to bring about in the days of Christ and his followers. Let's turn to Exodus 25, verses 23 through 30. Let's read that. You shall also make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long and 1 cubit wide and 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold and make a gold border around it. And you shall make for it a rim of a hand width around it, and you shall make a gold border for the rim around it. You shall also make 4 gold rings for it, and put rings on the 4 corners which are on its 4 legs. The rings shall be close to the rim as holders for the poles to carry the table. And you shall make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold, so that with them the table may be carried. You shall also make its dishes, its pans, its jars, and its libation bowls with which to pour drink offerings. You shall make them of pure gold. And you shall set the bread of the presence on the table before me continually. In his instructions of building the tabernacle, which was also the same basic instructions for the building of the temple. The same table that was supposed to be in the tabernacle was supposed to be in the temple when it was built centuries later. This table, it kind of intrigues me. I understand having the Ark of the Covenant there, because the Ark of the Covenant is the place of the literal presence of God. And it's where the high priest went once a year to make atonement for the sins of all of the people of Israel. So it was the meeting place where the people of Israel, through their high priest, met God and pled for the redemption of the people. Understand building that. The candlesticks that were there. I understand that. It was to provide light, or the candlesticks were to provide light. Symbolic light as well as real light. I can understand the building of the altar because you had to have a place to offer the sacrifices. I can understand building what they called, in some versions of the Bible, they call it the sea. Others call it the laver, the bronze laver, or brazen laver in the King James. Because they had to have a place where they could cleanse themselves before they offered the sacrifices and before they did the other services at the tabernacle and later the temple. But off to the side is this table. It's not a big thing. You can translate those dimensions of it into our terms, and it comes out a table 36 inches by 18 inches, 36 inches long, 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and 27 inches high. Not a big table. And as tables go, not really an impressive table, at least not by its dimensions. But this is of ultimate, absolute importance tabernacle and later the temple. The table, God's instructions made the table to be built so that it was recognized as a precious item. It was a very valuable item. He says it was to be made of acacia wood. I don't know if you're familiar with woodworking or with the cost of materials. Acacia is one of the hardest woods that's available and used for furniture and other purposes. Acacia is very expensive. I couldn't find out the exact cost of acacia wood today, probably because it's rare. It's hard to find. You can find acacia flooring, but it's probably not going to be anything more than a veneer if it's really acacia wood. Probably your flooring, that if it says it's acacia, is going to be some kind of made up synthetic floor covering. But that's not all. God wanted them to know how precious this table was, because so he said, you shall overlay it completely, legs and all, with pure gold. Well, you know, that really makes it not only a precious thing, but an expensive thing. Not gold plate, not gold leaf, but pure, solid gold you overlay it with. You even put gold over the border. You put gold rings on it for the rods to be put through that were going to be used to carry it when the people were on the move. And the rods that were to go through there were to be made out of acacia wood, and they were to be covered with pure gold. I read somewhere that it is estimated that the gold that was used to cover the table and the rings and the poles was 75 pounds of gold. The term that they would have used in the Bible was a talent in weight. 75 pounds of gold. I looked up the value. Today's value of gold, actually this was from Monday when I checked it, it's probably more than that now, was $5,104 per ounce. And I did math. I was never good in math, so I used my computer to figure this one out. Because this is numbers I can't add on my hands and feet. 16 ounces per pound came out to 1,200 ounces of gold that they used on this table. And that figures out at $5,104 a pound, that figures out to $6.1 million just for the gold that's covering this table. When I told Lainey that this past week, Lainey said, no wonder all the neighboring countries were trying to break in and take the stuff in the temple and the tabernacle. Yes. This was a tremendously valuable piece of furniture. Why did God have them go to so much trouble and so much expense to make this little table? It's not the table that was precious in the eyes of God. God wants his people to understand how precious what is put on that table is. Here's what was on the table. 12 loaves of bread. 12 loaves of bread. The number 12 is significant in the Bible. The number 12 represents God's power and authority. And it also represents the completeness of God's people. This is the whole people of God. This is everybody that belongs to God is represented by these 12 loaves of bread. Another thing that I see that's significant in this bread is that in the 26th verse, it says, "The bread of the presence on the table before me is to be set continually." In some translations of the Bible, this bread is called the continual bread. Every week, every 7 days, they had to replace those 12 loaves of bread. It's the continual bread. It never stops. But to me, the most important thing about this bread is what it is called. It's called the bread of the presence. And when I first read that, I thought, okay, it's the bread of the presence of God. But that's not it. The bread of the presence, the law of Moses said it was to be set there before God. Okay, the bread of the presence is the bread, and it is in front of the presence of God. So the bread of the presence, that presence is something else other than God. I think you and I can figure out what presence that bread on the table was. Because you remember in John 6, verse 35, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. The one who comes to me will not be hungry, and the one who believes in me will never be thirsty." So what you have here in the promising of the table in the tabernacle, there is the promise of the new presence that is coming. They have the presence of God there at the tabernacle over the mercy seat at the Ark of the Covenant. That's God. On the table is the presence of the one who is yet to come when this table is built. Jesus. So the table that we're talking about in the tabernacle is a table of promise. It's promising and predicting and prophesying the coming of another table that is of greater importance and of greater worth than this table. And on that table resided the bread of the presence of the one who was to come. I want you to understand how important and how powerful this presence that's on that table, represented by that bread, how powerful that presence is. In Matthew 16, verse 18, Jesus, in talking about building his church, which was the replacement for the temple and tabernacle as the place of the residence of God, he says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Now remember back to Psalm 23. The psalmist said, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The table in the tabernacle, the table in the temple, was not in the presence of the enemy. It was isolated from the presence of the enemy. That's why it was kept inside the walled city and inside the tabernacle or the temple, away from not just the enemy, but away from everybody except for the priests. But Jesus says, and remember, Jesus is the presence, the bread of the presence for us today. He said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Here's the table prepared in the presence of our enemies. Who is our enemy? Our enemy is Satan. Our enemy is the world. Our enemy is sin. And this table is made for us in the presence of the enemy. And the presence that is on that table is so powerful that the most powerful enemies, at their most powerful time, at their most powerful efforts, cannot prevail against the church because of the bread of the presence. The other thing that was on the table, there were implements or there were utensils there, including bowls and jars, and those were for the drink offering. The children of Israel were commanded to do all kinds of different offerings. They had the sacrificial offerings for sin. They had the wave offering. They had the offering for atonement. They had all kinds of different offerings that they were, sacrifices that they were making. One was the drink offering. And the drink offering was the best, the very best of the wine. And it was to be placed on the table there with the bread of the presence. Something I want you to understand about the drink offering, using the term drink in describing it may be a little bit misleading. Because when I hear the word drink, I think, like that. You pour it down your throat. Or somebody does. But the drink offering was not to be drunk. The drink offering was to be poured out. It was to be poured out before God. Nobody got the drink offering. I remember as a kid, when the Sunday morning service was over, a couple of us kids would rush up to the front because we were going to drink what was left over of the fruit of the vine. That's where I developed my taste for Welch's grape juice. I still like Welch's grape juice a lot, and every time I drink it, I think about back then. But the drink offering was not to be drunk, it was to be poured out. the pouring out of the drink offering symbolized the pouring out of one's life, the pouring out of one's devotion to God. It symbolized giving your life to God. How do I know that? The Apostle Paul tells me so. In Philippians 2, verse 17, Paul said, "But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all." Can't get a better person to define the drink offering than the Apostle Paul. He knew what it was all about. And so he described what was happening to him as his life being poured out as a drink offering. And if Paul's giving his life in service to God was him being a drink offering, what does that say about Jesus on the cross? Jesus poured out his life as a drink offering. There's something else about the symbolism of the drink offering. The drink offering symbolized two things. The first one was eventual victory God's people would have. For the people in the wilderness, when the tabernacle was built, the table was built, and the practice of having the continual bread, or the bread of the presence, and the drink offering on the table was there, this drink offering that was being poured out on a regular basis was the promise to them that Israel was going to have the eventual victory. Can you imagine being one of the children of Israel out in the wilderness at the beginning of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness? They had been promised that they were going to enter the promised land, and they were going to win out over all of those that inhabited the land, and they were going to get that land. And for them, the drink offering being poured out was symbolizing that whenever it was going to happen, they were going to get the eventual victory. And they did. Now, during the time of the kings of Israel, when they were doing the drink offering, they thought they already had the victory. But what they were doing was they were heading into the time of the captivity. Their real victory wasn't there yet. Their real victory didn't come when they entered the promised land, the land of Israel. The promise is of eventual victory when the victory is total and absolute, and that's pointing to Jesus Christ. When there would be a victory over sin and death. And so the drink offering was pointing to that victory. The second promise of the drink offering is that they would have a settlement in the land of promise. Big promise for when they were wandering in the wilderness. I know that there were times when the people of Israel in their wanderings began to disbelieve that promise. That's why they grumbled, that's why they griped, that's why they rebelled, and that's why they were so disobedient all the time. They wanted that promise, and they wanted it now. And they didn't understand that it was going to be in God's time. And then we look at our drink offering. Because we have a table today. And the table that we have today is a precious thing. It's not made out of acacia wood, and it's not covered with gold. because it's not the table itself, the physical table, that is of great importance. It's what's on it. We have the bread and we have the drink offering on our table. And the drink offering on our table promises us eventual victory, and it promises us a settlement in the better land of promise. Looking at the drink offering, we have to understand Jesus is our drink offering. Just as Jesus is our bread of the presence, Jesus is our drink offering. Mark 14, verse 24, Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is being poured out for many." I don't think you can have any doubt that he's calling himself and his blood to be our drink offering. Another passage in the law of Moses that speaks of some descriptions of the table of the bread of the presence is Numbers 4, verses 7 through 8, and it has two interesting things that it says that I think would be good for us to look at. First, it says that the table itself was to be covered over with a blue cloth. God doesn't do things the way men would do things. I'm thinking God wouldn't, God says put a blue cloth over that table. Men would say, well, look, it's made out of gold. Why do you want to cover that up? It's because God wants them to know something is more important than gold. Why a blue cloth? In the days of the Old Testament, colors had special meaning, just as numbers had special meaning. And blue, that it's referring to here, and some translations use a different term for blue, like violet or something like that, but basically it's a blue. I don't differentiate between colors like that. It's either blue or it's red, or, there are only about 5 different colors in my mind. Blue represents God's law. That's a simple fact of the matter for the Old Testament days. When you referred to something as being blue, people thought of God's law. Maybe that's where we get the term true blue, because God's law is always true. Psalm 19, verses 7 through 8 says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes." Don't you like those descriptions? The law is perfect. The testimony is sure. The precepts are right. The commandment is pure. And what does it do? Restores the soul, makes wise the simple, rejoices the heart, and enlightens the eyes.
That'll preach.
That will preach. In fact, it's preached right there in that passage. And so you cover, isn't it interesting? God says you cover that pure gold with a blue cloth. I think there's symbolism in that covering the gold. He wants them not to focus on the material things, not to focus on the wealth of that table, not to focus on how precious that gold is, but he wants them to focus on what's blue, the law. He wants them to focus on what's really important, what's really valuable. But that's not all. In Numbers 4, it also says that once they get the bread and the utensils and the drink offering on the table, they're to cover everything with a scarlet cloth. I think it goes without saying what the scarlet represents. Scarlet or red represents the blood. In this case, not just blood, but the blood of the atonement. You remember when they were rescued from Egypt, God told them, or at least when they were rescued from the death of the firstborn, the Israelites put blood on the doorposts and lintels of their houses, and then the angel of death passed over them and saved their firstborn kids. But the blood of the atonement is what this represents. You cover over everything with the blood. John 6, verse 54 says, the one who eats, Jesus said, the one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. The blood is of great, great, great importance. Jesus said, the one who eats my flesh, that's the bread of our bread of the presence, and drinks my blood, has eternal life. Brought to my mind a question. Why don't we do the same as they did? Why don't we cover the table? Why don't we cover the things that are on the table? I think, now this is just an opinion, so you can read it and do away with it if you think it's best. I think the reason that they covered that table then, or covered everything on the table then, was because this was all a mystery. The presence on that table was a mystery. The blood that it represented in the drink offering was a mystery because they didn't see it yet. Today, it's revealed because we have it revealed that we know the real table of God. By the way, when I was a kid, there was always a white cloth over the whole table with the communion service. There was a reason why that cloth was on that table when I was growing up in Georgia. It's because we had flies, and nobody wanted flies to get to the communion. But this brings us to one more thing, and this is about our relationship with the table today, and that is our conduct at the table. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I'd like for us to read verses 23. It's on your sheet there. It says verse 26 through 34, but we're going to read 23 through 34. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy way shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a person must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For the one who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not properly recognize the body. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number are asleep. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord, so that we will not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, have him eat at home, so that you do not come together for judgment. As for the remaining matters, I will give instructions when I come. Some things I want to say about our conduct at the table. We have a privilege that the Israelites didn't have. None of the Israelites, except for those chosen priests, could ever approach the table of the bread of the presence. In fact, most Israelites never saw it. But you and I assemble around that table. We join together at the table, and we share in the presence and in the blood of atonement that is at our table. Verse 26, he says, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. This is the thing I want to emphasize about our conduct concerning the table. We are to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And we proclaim it through our assembly around the table. Then in verse 29 also he says a person must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat the bread and drink the cup. We examine ourselves to see what's on in our lives, to see what needs to be corrected in our lives. And then in verse 33, he says, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. In our being around the table of the bread of the presence today, we ought to be paying attention to one another and seeing what the needs of each other are and taking care of each other's needs. Bottom line is, the table today, just as it was when it was first built and first put into the tabernacle, is all about the presence. In that day, it was about the bread of the presence. And as we said earlier, that presence that was on that table, in that bread, was Jesus in prophecy. Today, the table is about the presence of Jesus Christ because it's his body, his blood. But it's more than that. The presence is much more than that. In Luke 22, verse 27, Jesus said, for who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? He's talking about us as those that recline at the table. We are gathered around the table. He says, who's greater, the one that is at the table to partake or the one who serves at the table? He said, is it not the one who reclines at the table that's the greater? Now, if we stopped right there, that would say that when we are gathered around this table, we are the greater. You and I already know that's not true, but he makes it clear. He says, but I am among you as the one who serves. think that's powerful. When we gather around the table, it's Jesus who is serving us at the table. And it's Jesus who is greater. It's Jesus who is present. When we gathered this morning to partake of the communion, I hope you'll remember what we've just talked about. It's about the presence of Jesus Christ. And Jesus said, when you are gathered around that table, I'm the one that's there serving you. So when you partake of the Lord's Supper today and every time, I want you to remember one thing. I want you to remember who is here. Now you can look around and you can see the brothers and sisters that are at this location, and you can know that they are here. But I think in your heart's eye, you also need to see all of the brothers and sisters anywhere in the world who are partaking. They are there. They are present. But more important, Jesus is right there. You remember the time when Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them? Jesus is right there. You can't see him, but he is physically as well as spiritually there. He's present. And we ought to thank God that his Son is amongst us. And he is with us when we partake of the bread and the fruit of the vine at the table of the Lord. That's pretty powerful stuff. And it ought to remind us as to why the communion is so important. It ought to remind us and make us not only think of, but want to know that we're going to be doing this continually. I don't understand why people don't partake of the Lord's Supper regularly. I don't understand why people put it off to a month or 6 months or a year or just as special occasions. I don't understand that. It's a chance to be in the very presence of Jesus Christ. And we ought to just hunger for being around this table. Thank y'all.